All right. We finally made it to the first ever CFB Whispers Power Ranking exclusive. One moment. I'm going to take a sip from the Stanley. Credit to the wife, obviously giving me a manly Stanley here. Excuse me. All right, let's dive into this here. As you can see, obviously, I have on the screen here the AP Top 25, right? Like, this is exactly what the media society, whatever you want to call it, they are claiming the top 25 teams, at least thus far, week 8 and beyond. So, this is obviously subject to change, but they obviously have Oregon, Georgia, Penn State, Ohio State, Texas, Miami, Tennessee, LSU, Clemson, Iowa State, BYU, Notre Dame, Indiana, Texas A&M, Alabama, Kansas State, Boise State, Ole Miss, Pitt, Illinois, Missouri, SMU, Army, Navy, and Vanderbilt. So, not really sure, to be very frank with you all, as to my legitimate opinion on this. I'm not really one to say that I disagree entirely. If we were to take the top 12 teams right now and say that that's going to be an incredible playoff system, now that that's obviously expanded to a 12-team playoff, I wouldn't really say that that would be ideal. But then you look at 13 through 25 and you're like, okay, who would I actually include? If I were to substitute anything, it would probably be Indiana. They, in my opinion, need to be above Notre Dame. I would say Alabama, despite them losing to Vanderbilt and Vanderbilt being 25, they probably would give a lot of the teams ahead of them a run for their money. I actually think that despite them losing to Vanderbilt, like I mentioned, they would probably be favored in the majority of the games from 13 to 25, excluding 25. But I'm not really going to give this much attention because the CFB Whispers show power ranking exclusive is a little bit different. Now, granted, I did say I was going to explain what that difference is. That is a best win thus far through 8 weeks in the college football season. So mine's a little bit different, so let's just go ahead and dive on into this. But I wanted to actually give you guys a bit of a visual as to what we're looking at here based off what the media thinks. So mine starts with Georgia. Oregon, Texas, Tennessee, Miami, Penn State, Indiana, Ohio State, LSU, Texas A&M. Now, I understand that there are going to be a ton of you that are not going to agree with this, and that's totally fine. Like, that's cool. That's the reason why I do this. But let's just start at 10. Texas A&M, one loss, undefeated in the SEC. One loss, that being to Notre Dame. Not the sexiest loss, but not a loss that really matters because it's not a conference loss and they completely control their own destiny. So I'm just going to move on. We'll find out what happens whenever they play LSU this coming weekend because that's actually going to be a pretty big game. So we'll see what happens with that. Obviously, as you can see, moving in to that number 9 spot, coincidentally, LSU. LSU is also undefeated in conference play. So one of those teams is more than likely going to lose. I haven't seen a tie in my entire life, so we'll anticipate a change within the top 10 here. I wouldn't really say unless somebody outside the top 10 just does something just miraculous that will shift too much, but both of those are undefeated, so at least in the SEC play. So we'll see what happens. I think that that one's going to be a tough game. I mean, obviously LSU seems to have found something on defense. So, and Texas A&M offensively is pretty good, but you also know Texas A&M in terms of their head coach being able to dial up some things defensively. That's going to be an interesting game. So we'll kind of circle back to that one. I'll more than likely come back to that come on Tuesday, whenever we do our 2 games preview. So going up to Ohio State, here's my thing with Ohio State. A lot of you are like, hey, Ohio State has this incredible roster. I actually have some really good friends that are Ohio State fans. One in particular, hey, shout out to you, Kyle. You already know. Ohio State is one of those teams that will do incredible things in their own right in the Big Ten. They are currently on a losing streak against Michigan, which, in my opinion, that's really the only game that matters in that conference because those are the only 2 teams actually competing for anything. But Ohio State, since they actually lost to Oregon, they don't really have a significant win. So I still think that they're actually higher than what I think they should be. That's just based off our model. So, but at the same time, they still lost to Oregon. So we'll see. They have Penn State coming up. I know a lot of Ohio State fans are looking forward to that. And obviously they're going to be playing Indiana, which coincidentally is our number 7 team in this power ranking. And then they'll conclude the season with Michigan. But even if they were to beat Michigan, and I'm not going to comment on the game with Ohio State and Indiana, and then, of course, the game with Ohio State and Penn State, let's just disregard that for just a quick second. Let's just say hypothetically they won out, then, of course, they would climb at that point. But if Michigan was next on their schedule, I wouldn't put them any higher because Michigan is kind of a pretty sad team at this moment. So let's just transition on into 7, Indiana, obviously. Who in the hell anticipated Indiana being there? I mean, I know I didn't. And if you did, you are a liar. I'm not going to cuss anymore. You're a liar. That's just what it is. But, hey, Google them, right? Google him. Google the head coach. What is he, 63 years old? He's had success everywhere he's been. Why in the hell has he not found prominence? Why is he at Indiana? The fact that he's doing what he's doing at Indiana is absolutely incredible, but I don't have necessarily a significant win for Indiana other than the fact that they just keep winning. So argue me that. Now, Penn State's similar to an Ohio State, right? They'll play well, and then when they get to the games that actually matter, that's take that what you will. We'll see what happens with Penn State. They've seemed to have had a cupcake of a schedule, but then again, they're in the Big Ten. And that's not me discrediting the Big Ten, even though that's really what I was doing a moment ago. It's just you really only have a few selective teams in the Big Ten. And then when they actually compete against each other, they want to claim that it's self-sabotage. It's nothing like the SEC. I am a big SEC homer because if you just look at the history, at least in the last 20 to 25 years, again, argue me that. So Penn State's obviously sitting at our number 6 spot. Number 5, Miami. So Miami is actually begging for a loss. They legitimately are. They've not actually played anybody of relevance. Now, granted, if you want to look at that Florida team that's starting to catch fire right now, in my opinion, that's arguably their best win because they did go in opening weekend in the swamp and absolutely embarrass the Gators. And if you're a Florida fan, you probably don't like that, right? But you actually like the trajectory of where your team's heading now. So, hey, you lost to a really good Miami team. Offensively anyways. Defensively, it looked like Miami's defense was pretty elite. And as we've come to find out throughout the last 8 weeks, that aside from Florida, everybody else seems to have scored on Miami. So maybe they'll be able to figure some things out, but I have them there because when's the last time Miami's been relevant? We'll see what happens. They might stay there more than likely because, in my opinion, the SEC really isn't that strong. They might end up dropping. The only way they'll continue to climb any higher based off our model is if they actually beat Clemson, which seems to be on fire at this very moment. But I digress. Again, that's a conversation for another day. So let's just move ahead to our number 4 spot, Tennessee. Tennessee, again, similar to Miami, another team begging for a loss. That defense is only going to hold them so much, but you can't discredit the fact that in the last 2 weeks, they beat Florida. That's a big deal in that fan base. That's a big deal in terms of history. That's a big deal to the rivalry altogether. Now, granted, a lot of Tennessee fans want to say that Florida-Tennessee game is a rivalry, but it's not. It's only a rivalry if you actually have consecutive wins, and Tennessee's yet to do that against Florida. They're also yet to do that against Alabama, but they do have 2 wins in the last 3 years against Alabama, so that has to amount for something. And then you have the Florida game where they have only 1 win. I think Heupel has actually only beaten Florida twice, and he's been there, 5-6 years? So, but that defense is obviously enough to get them there. Again, my model is specifically based off of the wins that are most impressive, and Tennessee has beaten Florida. They have beaten Alabama. But that's it, man. I mean, if you really want to get technical with it, you can say that Oklahoma is obviously a big game, especially since it was played in Norman and it was Nico's legitimate first actual game where he had some sort of competition or pressure where he had to do something. But even in that game, if you watched it, you know he didn't really have to do much because that defense, again, carried them. So I digress. Again, that's a conversation for another day. Now let's move on to our number 3 spot, Texas. Texas is there because really I don't know why they're there. Our model just put them there. So I do believe they have an extremely talented roster. I do think that when you look at them from a physical perspective, if you're actually on the field with them like I've been in the past, you'll know that they're just animals. And Steve Sarkisian's obviously done what he needs to do to recruit the type of player he wants to be able to do what he wants to do. And he's had his way all the way up until the Georgia game. The only concern I have with Texas is they thought that, hey, we run the SEC. We're going to absolutely just demolish this competition. This is our first year. SEC what? Whatever. But then at the same time, they're also proud to be a part of the SEC. And then they go through this cupcake-like of a schedule, especially if you compare their schedule to Oklahoma, which I think is comical because Oklahoma's schedule is much harder. But I know that's not going to sit well with Texas fans. They face their first tidbit of adversity, and that is against Georgia, which is a true SEC team. I mean, they've won, 2 of the last 4 national championships, and Georgia just comes in there and absolutely embarrasses them. But I really don't know why Texas is actually ranked there. I'll have to go back and look at the model, kind of get with my Excel sheet, my team here, and see why exactly they're number 3. I guess at the end of the day, they have only 1 loss. In my opinion, if it were up to me, I would actually kind of flip 3, 4, and 5. Not going to really give it a specific order at this moment, but just because Miami's undefeated, I guess if I had to, I would put Miami at 3. I would put Texas at 5, and I would keep Tennessee at 4. So there you have that. Let's just go ahead and move on to number 2, Oregon. Oregon is number 2 because guess what? They beat Ohio State, and Ohio State at that time, I believe, was the number 1 team in the country. They might have been number 2 for those of you who actually know. I didn't do my research on that. I apologize. Just go ahead and correct me in the comments. I already know that's what y'all are going to do anyways. So that's just the beauty of actually running a channel. I'm the one in front of a camera. Remember that, not y'all. But at the same time, I still want y'all's opinions and input, and that's what it's all about. But Oregon, they look like a legitimate contender. In my opinion, they actually look like the best team in the Big Ten at this very moment. Now, granted, Indiana's coming out of nowhere, so we'll see what happens with that. If Indiana somehow ends up knocking off Ohio State and then going into the Big Ten championship, that would be an interesting game. But I still think Oregon would run away with that, despite what Google says. And if you don't know what that reference means, I'm again referencing the Indiana head coach. Now, Georgia, yes, they did lose to Alabama, and Alabama's obviously outside my top 10. You'll see that here in a moment. But they are a team that, when they find their groove, and it's hard to stop, especially them defensively. I mean, you have Will Muschamp leading that defensive staff, and it doesn't really take much for them to make adjustments, and they proved that in the Alabama game. Despite them actually losing that game, they still came out in the second half clicking on all cylinders, not only offensively, but they absolutely shut down Alabama. So Alabama just got so much of a lead that it was just really hard to come back from that deficit. And I think, again, like I mentioned earlier, if you were to have played that game between Alabama and Georgia on a neutral field or even home and away, it doesn't really matter. Georgia's going to come away with that at least 7-8 times, in my opinion. So Georgia is, in my opinion, the more dominant team. Georgia's, they beat the number one team in terms of Texas. Now, granted, I understand what I just said about Texas, but they still did beat the number one team. And they also beat Clemson, which is what I was referring to a moment ago. Clemson just seems to have caught some sort of fire, and excited to kind of see what they're doing in terms of the season and moving forward. Now, if we were to just transition on, I'm going to obviously start at 25. I have Florida at 25 because if you actually think about this, the 3 losses that Florida has, like I mentioned earlier in my video, they have a combined loss. The teams that beat them have a combined loss record of only 2 losses. Tennessee has 1 loss, that is to Arkansas, and Texas A&M has 1 loss, and that is to Notre Dame. And they also lost to Miami, but Miami is undefeated. So take that as you will, but I do believe that Florida does, despite having 3 losses, deserve to be in the top 25. Now, Navy and Army, that's a little bit new. But if you actually look at their offensive schemes, I'm not really going to put them there necessarily personally because I think that they actually are a legitimate top 25 team. But they have actually transitioned into being a little bit more adaptable to more than just the option in a lot of ways, or just the power I. So they're not really the best teams in terms of like the types of competition that they play, but they are also 2 of the few teams that are remaining undefeated teams. Now, Ole Miss was a little bit of a coin flip, to be real. They have 2 losses. So I do think that Lane Kiffin is kind of showing a little bit of signs of just not really wanting to be there. He tends to do this every time he's at a stop. He's been there for a little bit. It's almost as if he already knows he's heading out. But he does have an extremely talented roster. But Jackson Dart is obviously not what we thought Jackson Dart was going to be this year. And if you're an Ole Miss fan, I think you would agree with that. In my opinion, I think he's actually limiting the offense a little bit. So we'll kind of see if there's going to be any changes, as we move forward. But I would say if they don't continue to make progress on that offensive side of the ball, knowing Lane Kiffin can dial up, those explosive plays, but yet Jackson Dart can't seem to make it happen for him. I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at a couple of losses. I'm kind of eyeing that Ole Miss Florida game. It is in Florida. It is a noon game, so maybe that plays in favor of Ole Miss because Ole Miss isn't technically one of those teams that is used to playing those primetime type of games, those 3:30, that 7:30 SEC slots or CBS slots. They are used to waking up pretty early and playing those noon games, so they might be up for that one. Maybe Lane Kiffin has a little bit of a vendetta because he knows that there's a possibility he could be the next head coach at the University of Florida, and he wants to actually just bring that because if he doesn't and he ends up losing to Florida, why would the athletic director or the boosters or anybody in charge at the University of Florida consider him the next head coach if he can't beat the guy that they're trying to replace to begin with? Now, Pittsburgh is an interesting team. I think Pittsburgh is a team that's flying under the radar a little bit. Not really much to say about Pittsburgh. I'm sorry for you Pittsburgh fans at this moment. It's just what it is. It just seems like you guys always are winning these games, but then when it comes to the games that matter, especially when you play an SEC team, you just fall flat on your face, or at least you find a way to lose the game. Let's just reference the Tennessee game last year. Had no business losing that game. Going to the 20th slot, the Boise State team. Boise State, I mean, obviously you have a running back that's contending for the Heisman Trophy. I mean, the stats that he's putting up is it's actually ridiculous. I mean, the dude is a stud altogether. So, and then it's almost like Boise State doesn't want to continue to put the pedal to the metal and just embarrass the teams that they're playing because they're pulling out their studs, specifically this guy in particular, when it matters the most. I think this last game, he only played the first half, and then that was it. And then, of course, I know this is going to be a shock if we were to move on to 19, that I have Vanderbilt there, but Vanderbilt beat the number one team in the country, and that was Alabama. Now, I know that doesn't seem like it's a big, accomplishment at this time, but it's Vanderbilt. When's the last time Vanderbilt did that? Actually, as a matter of fact, Vanderbilt's never in the entire history of their program beaten the number one team in the country, ever. It's never happened. Take that as you will. They got some things cooking over there in Nashville. And, I mean, if you're in the SEC and you have Vanderbilt on your schedule, beyond week 8, I'm curious as to what that Texas and Vanderbilt game is going to look like. Like I mentioned earlier, that should be an easy bounce-back game for Texas, and it might very well be. I mean, that's just kind of how college football works. I think that Texas might just come out because they feel embarrassed after they just lost to Georgia in the fashion that they did at home, and they might actually destroy Vanderbilt. But Vanderbilt has that type of team that they're going to find a way to play as a unit. They support each other. Their head coach and that staff altogether comes in with an incredible game plan, and they've been able to execute thus far. And if you actually look at the history of Vanderbilt, whenever they do have successful teams in the last few years, what was it, back in 2013, whenever they started the season 5-0, and then they ended up actually losing like the majority of the rest of their games. If they start well, they typically fall off. Listen, we're in week 8, and they're not falling off. So that huge credit to that coaching staff. That team is just, they're dialed in. And then obviously that quarterback, I mean, that dude's a winner. And I know he transferred into Vanderbilt. He could have transferred, in my opinion, other places and made a bigger impact. But can you really make a bigger impact than the impact he's making now? I mean, he's legitimately taken a program that's not notoriously known for being good at football to actually being the number one team, and they just keep winning. So until they lose it all, I mean, it's hard for me to really say anything else, or at least anything negative about Vanderbilt. Now, moving on to 18, Missouri. Missouri's kind of one of those teams where they came into the season, they were really they were hyped up, and I don't really know what to think about Missouri at this very moment. I have no idea why they're at 18. If I were to have done this personally, it would have been a little bit further behind, but our model obviously likes them at 18. So Missouri has a decent schedule ahead of them. They have some games coming up that I think that they could very well lose. There are also some games that they've played thus far that they should have lost. Obviously this past one, they had no business winning that game, but hey, a lot of, you fight through adversity. Their quarterback goes to the hospital, and then all of a sudden he comes back and he leads his team to a victory. I mean, hell, what more could you ask for? I mean, that's an incredible leader. I don't know what kind of condition he's in now. Maybe he won't play this coming week. I don't know. I haven't heard anything about that. But for a guy to go to the hospital and then all of a sudden come back and go back into the game and then lead his team to a victory, I mean, there's really not much more of a better example in terms of leadership than that. Now, Kansas State is Kansas State, right? Like, they're always going to be consistently pretty good to average. I don't believe, in my opinion, that they should technically be at 17, but at the same time, I mean, who's really stopping that offense for the most part? I mean, they just consistently put points on the board. That defense is a little susceptible to me, but it is what it is. So, I'll have a little bit more information on Kansas State as I continue to watch more of their games, but our model likes them at 17. 16, Illinois. Illinois is a one-loss team. I mean, they're doing really well. Again, really not familiar with having them in the top 25 altogether. They're not necessarily a football school. I really don't even know if I were to just take an educated guess as to what type of school they would be, but who would want to go to Illinois? Now, I'm not saying that, again, as a negative person because this is a college football show, but hey, guess what? It doesn't really matter what I think because our model likes them at 16 and they're obviously doing a damn thing. So good for them. Now, if we were to move on to 15, Alabama, of course. Alabama, a lot of you would argue that they should actually be a bit further behind, but our model actually agrees with the AP poll with them being at the 15 slot. Alabama lost 2 games. Obviously, they lost an away game in Neyland Stadium to a Tennessee squad that only has 1 loss and seems to be catching some sort of momentum, at least from a defensive perspective. I don't know what's going to happen with that offense. Maybe that string of luck in terms of Tennessee football will continue. Maybe they might figure some things out offensively when it matters the most, but right now that don't look like it. Seems like, what was it, the last 3 games, Tennessee hasn't scored a single point in the first half, and then they come out, and then they all of a sudden it's just like this mind-blowing thing where they're just like, oh, we should just hand it to Samson. And that's exactly what they've done the last few weeks when they can't seem to put points on the board, when they know damn well that they've been putting all this pressure on Nico, who's a redshirt freshman, in the first half. Now, granted, it's not a lot of pressure if you are dialing up the right play and your quarterback just can't seem to execute it, right? Because we do know that even in the Florida game, Nico overthrew some passes. I don't know what y'all got to do to kind of get that, adjusted, get it fixed up. Patch that shit up. Just patch it up, right? We don't need another Joe Milton because that's exactly what it looks like. But if they can get that thing going and then he starts to connect on some of these passes where these wide receivers are absolutely open, well, then okay. But again, we're talking about Alabama here now, right? Alabama lost to Tennessee, then they lost to Vanderbilt. No excuse to lose to Vanderbilt. I don't care if first-year head coach, you have arguably one of the best rosters, if not the best rosters in terms of the FPI altogether in college football, and you lose to Vanderbilt. Now, it could be a player issue. It could also be a coaching issue in terms of just not getting your players up and ready to play that game. But I also, in defense, understand that who wants to get up and play Vanderbilt? Well, you need to never, ever, ever play to your opponent's level. Vanderbilt's proven over the last couple of years that they can compete with anybody. They beat Florida a couple of years ago for the first time. I can't remember the other team that they beat recently, but they've given Georgia a run for their money, and now all of a sudden they knock Alabama off. I mean, Vanderbilt's becoming one of those teams that you just can't overlook anymore. It's just not what it is. That's the new era of college football. Welcome to the NIL. Welcome to the transfer portal. Welcome to a coach that actually has some sort of common sense, and he can actually do the damn thing, and he can put together a scheme and a game plan that you probably just can't prepare for because you're not used to seeing this stuff from Vanderbilt. But they knocked them off. We have Alabama at 15. Notre Dame is obviously sitting at 14 if we were to move on. Notre Dame only has 1 loss. That loss is obviously an embarrassing loss. But I don't know. Hey, you get knocked down, you get up. Right? Notre Dame seems to have done that. They're obviously not in a conference. If they ended up making the playoff, they would have to obviously play in the first round. They're not eligible for a first round bye despite what their record might be, even if they were undefeated. But Notre Dame likes to do things their own way. We'll see what happens with Notre Dame and their schedule. They seem to play just miscellaneous teams just here and there because, I don't know, maybe it's similar to Texas where they just think they're in a different category altogether. But Notre Dame is Notre Dame, and I wouldn't be surprised. And again, this might not be the best thing to say for you Notre Dame fans, but they probably will find a way to lose another game that they're not supposed to. Now, moving on to 13, BYU. Not really much to say about BYU, and the only reason why I can say that confidently is because BYU is finding ways to win a game. Now, granted, the majority of their games haven't really been close. They've actually handled business the way that they needed to, handled business like a seniorized, veteran squad, and their head coach seems to be dialing up things at the right time. I mean, they're very fundamentally sound, and they play together as a unit. I mean, but at the same time, they don't really play in a conference that really means anything. So who have they actually played? They almost lost to a, 3, now 4 loss Oklahoma State team. They had to come back from behind when it was under a minute in the fourth quarter, and they were playing at home. Now, I'm not saying that Oklahoma State is just some cupcake that they should have just blew out. But if you actually look at the just the record altogether, if you were to, I guess, compare it in that way, BYU had really no business even being in a position to come back from that game. That's just the reality of that. But good teams always find a way to win. BYU found a way to win. That's all that matters. We'll see if that streak continues. Excited. Now, here's my thing with number 12, Iowa State. Iowa State, in my opinion, should be in the top 10, but apparently our model doesn't agree with that. Iowa State is one of those teams where their head coach is just extremely disciplined. He comes in, again, like what I've said with some of these other teams, with a game plan, and he's doing his thing. Iowa State's a very dangerous team. Now, they may not match up in terms of the FPI rankings out of high school and overall roster management, but Iowa State's the real deal. And if I had Iowa State on my schedule beyond week 8, I don't know, man. Might be a tough game because Iowa State seems to be on a mission right now. Will that transition into anything and come to fruition? Maybe they'll make it to the playoffs. Maybe they won't. I don't know. But according to our model right now, if the season ended today, they would make it to the playoffs. So we'll see what happens as the season progresses. Now, number 11, finally, last but not least, Clemson. I mentioned earlier, Clemson's obviously catching some fire. Clemson is one of those teams where they open the season against Georgia. It's not the same Dabo Swinney team that we've seen of old, but as of lately, it has been. They're playing really strong defense. Granted, they're not in the best conference. Very curious if they continue to play at the level that they're playing at. They'll more than likely end up meeting Miami in the ACC championship game, and that'll tell us a lot about this team. But a little bit of me wonders if they want some sort of a revenge game against Georgia. Now, will that come to fruition? We'll find out. I don't know. Clemson, as of lately, they're just on fire, and hard for me to tell because you have every other team taking advantage of the transfer portal, NILs, etc., and then Dabo Swinney over there just kind of in his own world thinking, hey, I can just continue to build a roster based off my recruiting out of high school. And, a lot of people want to make fun of it, but they're sitting with one loss and they're embarrassing everybody since they lost to Georgia, which is actually a respectable loss. So I'll leave that with you guys. Now, obviously, these rankings are subject to change, but hey, this was the very first CFB Whispers show, power ranking exclusive. I broke down exactly why each team was where we placed them. Now, granted, my opinion is one thing, our model is another thing. But if you guys have some opinions on where we have things, I'm sure you guys are going to say, well, this team shouldn't be there and that team shouldn't be there. Understand that this isn't based off overall record. Clearly, look at the top 25. And then compare the AP top 25 to what we have here. Our model is just different, but we still want to hear from you all together. So, again, let us know your thoughts. And listen, it's been a long show. But if you guys have obviously tuned in this long, we really appreciate your support. Obviously, we want you to return. It costs you literally $0, 0 cents. Just give some love. Smash that like button. Subscribe. Share it. Barber talk again, except in reference to a college football show. So if you guys do have some content, anything you want us to discuss, let us know. But just know that we will be releasing this stuff on a weekly basis. We'll be discussing this stuff as well. But thank you guys again for obviously joining me on the show. And until we come out with our prediction video, I'm excited to continue, doing this. So thank you guys again. Smash that like button. Obviously share, subscribe, show your support. We really appreciate it. Thank you guys for helping us out so much. And until next time, CFB Whispers out.